Welcome to the second, hello? Welcome to the second of three MBB distinguished lectures by Daniel Kahneman. For those of you who weren't lucky enough to be able to come to the lecture yesterday, we wanted to let you know that that's going to be available on the MBB website, a tape of both the lecture and the subsequent discussion by David Laibson and with members of the audience. For those of you who were lucky enough to come to that, you know that Professor Kahneman took us on a 40-year journey through studies looking at the interrelated roles of intuition and rational judgment in our choices and decision-making with a set of insights and observations that led to a really bracing discussion of the role of general unifying theories and of specific phenomena in the social sciences. So today, Professor Kahneman is going to move even beyond the social sciences into questions that impact on the humanities and other fields about the nature of human rationality. After the talk that he gives today on decision-making and rationality, there'll be a discussion by Francis Kamm, who is professor of philosophy in FAS and also of philosophy and public policy at the Kennedy School. So without further ado, Professor Kahneman.
Excuse me for being jacketless, but it really is warm here. I had a minor disaster today, one of those things that really test you when you're giving. My slides kind of disappeared, so I'll be talking without slides. Worse things have happened. I still have some notes. I will really talk about four things, and I'll go further than 40 years ago. I think I'll go maybe something like 55 years ago when I was an undergraduate. I'll talk about what to me is in some sense the good old days, how psychologists thought of decision-making before the cognitive rational revolution of the 1950s and 60s. Then I'll talk about the standard rational agent model, and I'll talk about some phenomena of theory-induced blindness, I think, that this model induces. Then I'll talk about prospect theory, which was the theory that Amos Tversky and I developed in reaction to the rational agent model and expected utility theory. And then I'll talk about theory-induced blindness that prospect theory seems to have induced in people that make them take it more seriously than it deserves to be taken. And I'll end with some recent developments and indications of future trends, some of which are pointing just backwards to a resurgence of emotion and to some extent to a resurgence of belief in rational models, and all of this quite empirically based and I think very interesting and very recent. So that's my plan for today. Now when I started out, I decided only today that I'd tell that story, but when I started out as an undergraduate, what came closest to a treatment of decision-making, I think, in psychology, was Kurt Lewine's analysis of the life space. Kurt Lewine was a social psychologist, probably some say the greatest social psychologist of the 20th century, and I learned his work when I think I was either a first-year or a second-year undergraduate, and it marked me for life. I don't think, actually, that I have ever seen better psychology since. And when I was teaching policy in psychology and policy at the Woodrow Wilson School, the first thing that I would teach them was what I'm going to tell you about now, because I think it's non-intuitive, I think it's awfully important, and somehow I think not all of it has been forgotten. Some of it has been remembered and is influential, but some of the insight that Kurt Lewine had in the 1930s have been lost. And that, I think, is interesting just to trace how they have been lost. Now, Lewine described, he was very influenced by modern physics when he was writing in the 1930s. And the analogy that impressed him was the analogy of a force field. And he imagined the individual as a point in a force field, subjected to forces. And what that meant was that he externalized all motivations. So it's not that you wanted the apple. The apple was out there and it was pulling you. So the apple was attractive and it was pulling you. The visit to the dentist was represented in the life space, which also had a temporal dimension, and it was aversive and it pushed you away. And decision-making, and that was very important in the force field, where the point was at an equilibrium of forces that were pushing in different directions. So behavior at any point in time could be otherwise if pressures or external stimuli were different from the way they happened to be, then behavior would change. So that is a model that emphasizes conflict and that emphasizes the situational determinants of behavior. It's a very different image from the kind of image that developed later. Certainly the image that is current in decision theory, where everything is from the inside and out. Now, attractive and aversive forces had different characteristics in Kurt-Lewin. And there was what he called a gradient of approach and a gradient of avoidance, so that as you came closer to the apple became more attractive. And as you came closer to the visit to the dentist, that became more aversive. But the gradients were different, and they had different characteristics. This, by the way, was empirically validated with animals later, and it was taken up later, by Neil Miller. But Kurt-Lewin, I think, had it all. And in his model of conflict, the gradient of aversive forces was steeper than the gradient of approach, so you could have them crossing. I could do that with a slide, but you can imagine a steep gradient and a shallow gradient crossing. And when you had the gradient crossing, you had a paralyzed individual. You had an individual that wasn't moving, not because there were no forces acting within or on that individual, but the individual was not moving because the forces were in equilibrium, and he was stuck there. He or she was stuck there. That is, I think, really quite clever. And it explains a lot of things. But just the idea that conflict is ever present is an idea that, surprisingly enough, is lost when you take the economic model and the models that follow the economic model. They're conflictless models. And I'll explain that a bit more. Now, so this idea of the gradient of avoidance explained how worries take over as deadlines approach. And I had in my notes such as the deadline to prepare this talk. But and the differences in the steepness of the gradients explain some inconsistencies, like on the part of speakers, the willingness to accept a talk if it's going to be next year, and the regret that is experienced as the time comes near. And that's a recurrent experience. People, by the way, don't learn. They know about this. They in some way they know it's going to happen to them, but they don't learn. And the paralysis point is really quite interesting too, because paralysis is in fact not uncommon. You can think of those couples who can bring themselves neither to break up nor really to live together properly, and they're stuck between those opposing forces. And Levin's theory of conflict also incorporated the best bit, and I mean this, the best bit of applied psychology or applicable psychology that I have ever seen. And it's a bit counterintuitive, and it's an idea about what to do when you want to change somebody's behavior. So it's about behavior change. And in the Levinian model, there are two ways of doing that. So you have an individual and in the force field, and then you have a goal, and you would like the individual to move. It's your goal. You'd like to move the individual in that direction. And there are really two ways you could do this. You could increase, as he called them, the driving forces. You could push the individual in that direction by increasing the forces. Or you could reduce the restraining forces. Both of those would move the equilibrium point closer to where you want to go, but they would do it in very different ways. And the insight, which that's what I remember as sort of the key insight, is you're not in the same state when the driving forces are increased or the opposing forces are reduced. When you reach the new equilibrium, you are at a lower state of tension if the restraining forces have been reduced. And the tension being measured simply by the strength of the opposing forces. Look how elegant this model is. It's gone. I haven't seen that discussed in recent years. Maybe I'm missing it, but it's not. I think that should be textbook material. And I mean elementary textbook, because what this tells you, and I still remember the thrill of the insight, as a first or second year undergraduate, is it tells you that when you want to change someone's behavior, there is something you should do first. And there is a question that you could ask. Now, the natural intuitive response when you want to change people's behavior is to drive them there. And you drive them there by arguments, or you drive them there by incentives. I mean, this is what comes naturally, and I've looked at this repeatedly. This is what people do when they role play, trying to influence somebody else. They use the driving forces. Now, the question that Kurt Lewin suggests, or that his treatment suggests, is a very different one. It's, why aren't they doing now what I want them to do? And if there is a reason, if I can figure out why they're not doing it now, that's what I should change. And what should I change? I should change their world. I shouldn't try to change them. They're a force, they're a point in a force field. I should try to change the force field. I should try to make it easier for them to move in the direction I want, instead of making it harder for them not to. I think this is beautiful psychology. There is just so much in it. And so this kind of psychology that has conflict in it, that has situational determinants in it, just gave a very different view of what it is to make decisions. And of course, it got people to, it got you to the advice of removing barriers rather than adding incentives, or in fact using arguments. It's interesting when you think deeply about what that means. It means that you are if you want to convince people, you should ask questions. You should not bring arguments. That just follows naturally from the Lewinian theory. We've lost that. Now, that's sort of important. I mean, we've lost it. Some people have remembered it, but it's not as central, I think, now as it was then, and it deserves to be. I don't know why it's not central. It just got, swept away by newer developments. Now, there is, I don't know actually if he's a psychologist, but Brian Wansink is an expert on nutrition and food who has written a book called Mindless Eating, which is, in many ways, just a very fine Lewinian book. Because in that book, Brian Wansink basically asks the question, why do we eat things we don't want to eat? What is it that makes us eat things? And his analysis is essentially situational. And it's, there is a lot of very good advice there, but his experiments are brilliant. So there are many experiments. So, for example, you give people a plate of food that has more food than they can eat, or that they are going to eat. So they eat, and they leave some. Now you give another group another plate of food that has even more food than the first group. They eat more. So the first group eat as much as they can, and the second group eats more, because you have created a different situation. People eat more when the plates are bigger. Then he has that lovely experiment where people eat soup from a bowl that essentially, well, I wouldn't say never empties, but empties very slowly. So there is a contraption such that the bowl is connected to another vessel, and when you just eat, it comes down at about 1/3 the rate that it would normally. People eat and eat and eat and eat. This is situationally driven. You want to change people's behavior, he says, change their situation, change the size of plates, change the size of glasses, change what is at eye level in the refrigerator. Those are the things. If you want to change behavior, that's the way to do it. And that gives you a different sense on what directions are. I mean, you know, it's not about maximizing utility. It's just different. But it gives you a sense of what real behavior is like. And in some sense, all these are decisions. I mean, yes, that lovely study where I think he did it on secretaries. And he replenished, I don't know exactly how he did it. There was a bowl of candy that he would replenish every day. And he would count the number of candy that they ate. And all he manipulated was the physical distance between them and the candy. And if they had to get up just to the shelf to get a candy, they ate less than half of what they would if the candy was within reach. It's the situation. And it's a very different way of thinking that's about behavior than what came later. Now, this model sort of disappeared, at least as a treatment of decision-making. When you thought of decision-making, you know, when I was an undergraduate, you thought of will and you thought of conflict. And, you know, to a large extent, conflict between reason and emotion was something that certainly people were thinking about at that time. And those notions, to a very large extent, disappeared. And they disappeared from the treatment of decision-making because the treatment of decision-making came under the control of a computational theory and of an economic theory. And there was a cognitive revolution in psychology after World War II, which made it generally compatible to think, to take the rational agent as a first hypothesis, the rational agent model as a first hypothesis. It just seemed like a natural thing to do. I mean, when I was a student, say in the late 1950s, the field was really very impressed by demonstrations in which psychophysical judgments of people, you know, about discrimination were well described by statistical decision theory. And, you know, there was a theory of the ideal observer. I mean, the words were informative. A theory of the ideal observer, and people came fairly close to being ideal observers. And that was a model of decision-making when you can make different kinds of errors and you trade the errors off against each other and the probabilities. It's a variant of expected utility theory. Actually, the very first piece that I wrote, and that's 1961, I think, after joining the faculty of Hebrew University, was a review of the rise of rational models. That something seemed to be happening in psychology at the time, that it had changed from the time where learning theory was dominant. Now something else was dominant. And that was actually the beginning of cognitive psychology, though I didn't know that at the time. But that's how psychology largely began. Now, the economic theory is a computational theory. And it developed, let me see, I'm out of sequence here. Well, let me first describe the current paradigm in psychology, and then I'll get to the history a bit later. The current paradigm in psychology, and you know, that's the paradigm that I've been working in, you know, my professional life, is in opposition to the rational agent model. So the rational agent model came from economics and expected utility theory, and it was fashionable for a while. In the 1960s, it was used as a very good approximation by psychologists, including the psychologists who trained Amos Tversky at the University of Michigan. So there was a sense that everybody at the University of Michigan, those who were doing psychophysics and those who were doing decision theory, in one way or another, used that broad model, that rationality is an approximation and we can characterize, it's a good approximation, and we can characterize the deviations from it. Now, the paradigm that is, a very prevalent paradigm these days is in clear reaction to that. So this has been the paradigm in which I've been working and many, many others. And it actually started at Michigan, I think. It started among students of Ward Edwards, who himself was a believer in conservative Bayesian, but there was a crowd of students, including Amos Tversky and Paul Slovic and Sarah Lichtenstein, but those were the three sort of big names that emerged from this, who began as graduate students to ask questions about the rational model and to run empirical studies sort of demonstrating where the rational model failed. And when I started working with Amos Tversky, he was there, roughly. And we saw yesterday some of the ways in which this reaction against the rational model works in judgment. So we have people who violate the rational model because they violate the essential principles of probability theory and statistics. So they neglect base rate, they're susceptible to various biases in the weighting of information, and so on. In the context of decision-making, very much, and it's even clearer in the context of decision-making, there is a sharp theory of what people ought to do, well-defined. It's expected utility theory. It's fairly simple. It generates a lot of predictions. And if you're an experimental psychologist, it's gorgeous because so many of these predictions are false. I mean, you can falsify the theory very easily if you have the freedom to generate your own experimental situations. I mean, how well the theory works in the world is a separate question, but that it's very easy to find counterexamples, I think, is not in question. Now, let me tell you a bit about expected utility theory. Modern expected utility theory began with a formalization of a theory, formalization by von Neumann and Morgenstern, of a theory of decision-making that had been proposed 200 years earlier. And it was proposed by Daniel Bernoulli, and a member of that illustrious Swiss family of scientists and polymath. And I mean, they were doing physics and decision theory and mathematics all at once. Now, his was a theory that changed the way that people thought about the value of gambles. Until then, the mathematics of the value of gambles were the mathematics of expected value. He had the idea, and it's a profound psychological insight, he had the idea that what matters is not the amount of money that you're likely to gain in a gamble, when you put value on a gamble, it's the utility of that amount, and utility is not a linear function of value. Big insight. Because if you say that, as he said, the extra ducat doesn't mean the same thing to the person who's got 10 ducats and to the person who's got 100 ducats. You know that immediately that there's something profoundly right. From that, you can derive, as he did, actually anticipated Weber's law and Fechner's law by more than 100 years. You can derive, he derived, that the utility function is going to be a logarithmic function. That is, that it's 10 ducats that mean the same thing to the person who has 100 as 1 ducat means to the person who has 10. Now, just absolutely wonderful stuff. It's one of the most beautiful essays I've read. And what it explains was the dominant feature of decision-making, which is risk aversion, the dominant feature of financial risk. So that when people are given a choice between a gamble and a sure thing that has the same expected value of the gamble, if it's a positive choice, and in his Bernoulli's theory, all the choices were positive, as I'll say in a minute, people will take the sure thing. So if you're given a choice between a 90% probability of winning 1,000 ducats or dollars, or winning 900 for sure, most people will pick the 900 for sure. And Bernoulli's theory broadly explained that. It did beautiful things. he solved the problem of how much people should be willing to pay for insurance. And he had that really, it's a gorgeous problem. You have the merchant who is buying a ship loaded with spice in Amsterdam and is sending it to St. Petersburg in the winter, where 5% of those ships get lost. And then he discusses how wealthy will the merchant be the ship gets there, what will be left of the merchant's wealth if the ship doesn't get there, and then 95%, and then he multiplied the utilities by the probabilities, and he solved the problem of how much the merchant should be willing to pay for sure in order not to run the risk of losing the financial risk associated with losing the statement. Now, Bernoulli introduced an element into psychology here. That's the utility of wealth. And the proposal is that instead of computing the expected value of a gamble, the merchant computes the expected utility of the gamble, or the expected utility of the states of wealth that could arise from playing the gamble. Different view. Von Neumann and Morgenstern, late in the 1940s, provided an axiomatic foundation of Bernoulli's view. They reversed engineered, if you will, Bernoulli's theory, but they did it in a very different way. They proposed a set of axioms that a rational man or woman should want to follow. So that's the axioms of rational choice. And they proved that if someone follows all these axioms, then the behavior of that person in choosing among uncertain options can be described basically by Bernoulli's theory. So you can assign utilities to states of the world, and people's preferences are going to be governed by the expected utility. Now, let me point out, it's already clear that here there is no conflict. In Bernoulli, there is no conflict. You just compute, and then you pick the one that's best. You don't agonize. In that theory, you know, in computational theories, there's something that really glares at you as a psychological problem. When you have two options that are close to equivalent in terms of expected utility, you are said actually to be indifferent between them. Indifference? I mean, those are the conflicts that people find the hardest between options that are equally attractive. When you do the economics of this, it's indifference. Those should be easy decision problem because it doesn't matter. You're getting the same expected utility in both cases. And you know, when you think about that, and you think that psychologists took that very seriously, it's a bit strange, because psychologists ought to have known better, but they didn't, we didn't. I mean, I didn't. Now, there was one thing that followed from the von Neumann-Morgenstern axioms, and that was, actually, I mean, it was already in Bernoulli's axiom. It was that the psychological response to probabilities should be linear. And that really follows directly from Bernoulli. So that, and now notice, because this is pretty strange, we have Bernoulli's theory. It involves attaching, and that's how Bernoulli described it, solving decision problems by looking at the utility for wealth and assigning linear probabilities, linear responses, psychological responses to probability. That basically is the theory. That's the essence of the theory. Now, you know, these are both non-starters. I mean, that's the interesting thing. They're both non-starters. The idea that you make decisions by considering states of wealth, and the idea that the response to linearity is linear. I mean, you can see counterexamples. You can see counterexamples very easily once you know that there are counterexamples there to be seen. But why it took so long, why it was so hard to see those counterexamples is really an interesting question. Here is where Bernoulli runs into problems. You have this idea in the Bernoulli model that the merchant chooses between options in terms of the expected utility of wealth that is associated with those options. Now, let me give you an example. You have an individual who is faced with a choice, and let's make that a wealthy individual, between having 2 million for sure and equal probabilities of having 1 million or 4 million. Okay? So that, you would say, that's an individual who should be reasonably satisfied. Now, will the choice of the individual be the same? And now I'm asking a psychological question. If the individual currently has 500,000, or if the individual currently has 12 million? And let me tell you, they won't be. And if you stop to think about it, it's pretty clear that the individual who currently has 500,000, the 2 million looks very, very, very good to that individual. And, the 4 million is more, but the 2 million is very dominant. It's a big improvement. For the person who has 12, this is a disaster anyway. It could be a bigger disaster, it could be a smaller disaster. Their 2 and 4 million are much closer, and you are very likely to get different choices. Now, this is a moment of introspection, I think, really is sufficient to convince you that the answers are bound to be different. And what's happening is that you need at least another parameter. And the parameter is how much wealth you have now. Without knowing how much wealth you have now, you can't do the psychology right. Now, that problem arises. How many people here have taken a course in economics? Good. I mean, I haven't, but one of the things that you certainly have learned, you have learned about indifference curves. So all of you remember indifference curves. Now, I mean, I have no idea when I noticed that. I was probably pretty sophisticated when I noticed it. But I remember looking at indifference curves when I was doing decision research already. I mean, so I was trying to sort of catch up. And I looked at indifference curves seriously for the first time, and I couldn't believe what I saw. I mean, in fact, I didn't understand it, because I kept looking for something that wasn't there. So you have that indifference curve, the classic is between leisure and income or something like that. And, it's sort of a smooth, nice line. And I was looking to see, where is the individual now? I mean, the individual must be somewhere now in that space. That's not represented. And it's not represented because it is assumed that it doesn't matter. Because the theory assumes that it's the final states that matter. And if it's final states that matter, it doesn't matter where you're from. Come on. I mean, this, in fact, when you do the research empirically, indifference curves are seriously bent around the point where you are. Because people do not have the same attitude to gains and to losses. And there is a discontinuity in your response to gains and to losses. And so gaining 100 and losing 100 are not the same thing. That's what we call loss aversion. All of this, so you get all of this, but you need the extra parameter. And the question that I'm raising in terms of theory-induced blindness is, why on earth did it take such a long time for that to become obvious? And I can tell you that when it kind of became obvious to Amos and to me, it wasn't because we were so clever. It happened because of a misunderstanding of mine. I was learning, he knew decision theory, I didn't, and I was learning about decision theory, and he gave me a book. He had co-authored a book on mathematical psychology as a graduate student, and he gave me that book to read, told me to read chapter 5. It was about decision making. We'd been working for 5-6 years by that time. And, I read it. And there were experiments there run by some of the greatest minds of the 20th century, the philosopher Davidson and Patrick Suppies. And they were very much influenced by the von Neumann-Morgenstern theory. And they were trying to draw the utility function. But they were asking people questions about gains, not about losses, actually. Nobody was thinking about losses. They were asking people questions about gains. You could have that much for sure, or get that much for sure, or get much more with a certain probability. And I came back to Amos and I said, I don't understand. I mean, the function is drawn on wealth, but the questions are about gains and losses, what's going on. And I was absolutely sure that I was making a stupid mistake. But in fact, I wasn't. I mean, in fact, I think they were. But for me, it's really not that I saw immediately what was wrong with that. I mean, I was just doing what an experimental psychologist is supposed to do. I was taking the graph seriously and wondering whether, the axes of the graph and the description of the problem corresponded to each other. But they didn't. And, I knew enough perception to know that it's kind of unlikely that the psychophysics of gains and losses are going to match up exactly with the psychophysics of wealth. So that you're thinking gains and losses, but you can derive a utility function for wealth. You couldn't. And that's one example. Here is another one that is in some ways even simpler. You have two people, person A and person B. So person A owns 1 million and gets news that he has earned 100,000. Person B owns 4 million and he gets news that he just lost 500,000. Now, who of them is happier? It's not a difficult question. And now B is still better off. B has 3.5 million. And the poor A only has 1.1. But we know who is happier. Now, Bernoulli was thinking in terms of happiness. That's the utility that he was thinking about. This is theory-induced blindness. And it can last indefinitely. It can last for centuries. And I just wonder, I don't understand it. I mean, I hope there are philosophers of science or historians of science who can be better, sociologists of science maybe. These counterexamples are not very fancy. I mean, they're really very straightforward. But I have never seen them discussed anywhere as counterexamples to Bernoulli or to expected utility theory. This is weird. And now there is a very good rationale for what Bernoulli did, and that explains part of the story. If you were designing a rational agent, you would probably design the rational agent to be sensitive to wealth, not to gains and losses. I mean, gains and losses, it's about the emotion of the moment. It's kind of superficial. Ultimately, B is going to stay richer than A by a lot. And, if wealth matters for something, and it clearly does, there's even an article about this in today's New York Times, wealth does matter. If wealth matters to well-being, then B is better off than A. And if people are rational and try to be better off, then that's the way to do it. And indeed, it is rational to adopt what I would call the wealth frame. People, by the way, spontaneously do this when they think of retirement. So when you plan your retirement, you're thinking of monthly income, or you're thinking of the wealth that produces a certain monthly income. You're doing it as Bernoulli wanted you to do it. But most of the time, that's not how we think. We think in terms of gains and losses, relative to some reference point, which most of the time is what we have, some of the time is what we think we should have, or what the neighbor has, or something. Now, the alternative that, by the way, I brought that question to Amos, my question, and he said, yeah, you're right, actually, it doesn't make sense. And then that very day, we decided that, our theory would be about gains and losses. I mean, that was immediate. Now, we were not the first. There had been, Harry Markowitz had done that some 15 years earlier, or more. But he had not taken his own ideas seriously. He never pursued it. We were very serious about gains and losses. And that's the essence of prospect theory, is really that move from wealth to gains and losses. Now, I sometimes have the image of theories parading naked, with too few children around to point that out. I mean, people, the contrast between the exquisite sophistication with which minor points are debated and the neglect of evident foundational weaknesses is a real mystery. And I don't know. I have nothing to contribute. Now linearity. Bernoulli assumes, and von Neumann and Morgenstern prove, the necessity of linearity. It's a very elegant proof. It follows from axioms that really most people would want to obey, and so on. That is an absolute non-starter. You can see that right away, because what does linearity mean? Linearity entails the prediction that the difference between 0% and 1% is the same psychologically as the difference between 46 and 47%, which is the same as the difference between 99% and 100%. Come on. That's just not true. And you see it right away that it isn't true, and you know that there are big discontinuity, going to be big discontinuities at 0 and at 100, and that the difference between 46 and 47 is negligible, whereas the others, you know, from impossibility to possibility, are very important. I mean, think of worrying parents, you know, worrying whether something is happening to their girl. I mean, 0 and 1%, big difference if she's at home or if she's just late. Now, here again, why didn't people point it out? There is actually an amusing story, but I won't spend time on it. It's just a little time. Still lives a very cantankerous French psychologist, Maurice Allais, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics some years ago. And he's really a nasty character. He convened in the early 1950s a meeting of the greatest decision theorists and economists of the age that met in Paris, and he confronted them with a problem. And it's a very complicated problem. But he got their preferences in 2 questions, and he could show that their preferences were inconsistent with the axioms of the theory. And what he was demonstrating, whether the response to probability is not linear. I mean, in effect, what he was demonstrating is that the psychological difference between 0% and 1% is greater than between 10% and 11%. Believe me, it took me a long time to work out why that was violating the theory. It is not trivial. It's not easy. And there was a lot written about this because some illustrious economists were there. Paul Samuelson was there, and Ken Arrow was there. It must have been a very, very good group. And he thought, Maurice Allais did, that he called that a critique of the American school. I mean, he thought he had just, they'd just go home and admit who is master, and they will never hear about classical utility theory and von Neumann and Morgenstern again. Now, what happened actually was that the Allais paradox remained a staple of decision theory. People talk about the Allais paradox now, more than 50 years later. Prospect theory, the first assignment that Amos and I took upon ourselves was to try to figure out the psychology of the Allais paradox. But in fact, it's the nonlinearity of probability that he was demonstrated in an extraordinarily complicated way. And anybody could see that the response to probability is not linear. I asked one of my colleagues, a famous economist, I asked him, why? What's that with theory? That you need an Allais paradox to be taken seriously? And he did. Frankly, I don't think he had a good answer. But he was completely unconvinced by my question. I mean, he knew that there must be a good answer. That in part, it's because what Allais did, the theory is about choices, and Allais, translated those preferences into choices, and it's technically difficult to do otherwise, and so on. But the idea that you could start from the psychology and say this is a non-starter, and then let's figure out what choice demonstration we could have, that it didn't come. Now, the key move for psychologists, and for economists, of course, was to put the normative theory to work as a descriptive theory of how people actually make choices. So I described the impact of that on psychology. And it is still the dominant model in economics. I mean, those of you who were here yesterday and heard David Leibson heard, this is, he is struggling. He is part of a minority movement that want to question this. Now, there's been a succession, I've been involved actually as an observer or as a participant in a succession of challenges to the rational model. The first one as an observer, to the LA paradox. Then Amos and I studied framing effects. And a quick example of the framing effect is that you do not have the same attitude to a cold cut that is described as 90% fat-free or 10% fat. You just like the first one better than the second. You do not have the same attitude. And in fact, Harvard Medical School professors, I think, do not have the same attitude. When the same medical statistics are described as 90% mortality, survival during the first month after surgery, or 10% mortality during the first month after surgery. 10% mortality is really no good. And 90% survival is pretty good. And that is intelligent people. That's, as intelligent as they come. So that's a challenge to the rational model. And Emerson really had a sense of theory. He knew that was very important. And he knew that whereas Allais had struck at the axioms of the theory, what we were doing with framing was striking at the primitives of the theory. That is, a theory has primitives. It has basic concepts. And the idea that the basic, and those are undefined concepts. You start with those primitive notions. And the primitives were in question of what an outcome is. If an outcome can be described in different ways and it seems not to be the same outcome, then there is a problem with the primitives. Later, I was involved in something that I'll mention briefly tomorrow, in another kind of challenge to the rationality model, which comes from the fact that people frequently don't know what they will like. They do not know, and Dan has written a book that is dedicated in good part to this. They do not know right now what they will enjoy later. They really make big mistakes in their anticipation of their future hedonic states. How does a rational agent cope with this? I mean, what is the meaning of rationality for an individual whose values and desires do not correspond to, the ultimate outcomes, which are consequences? People do not know what they will enjoy, and they do not necessarily enjoy what they used to want. So we have a real problem there. There is another problem, another challenge to rationality, and I was very pleased, actually. I was very pleased that David mentioned it yesterday, because that one hasn't been sufficiently emphasized. It's what I call the comprehensiveness problem. If you are normative, it's not only states of wealth, it's everything you've got to take into account. I mean, the outcome for a rational agent, the anticipation, and David spoke of that, you've got to know what opportunities we're going to have in future and how you're going to respond. And so you have two individuals. One of them is more risk-taking than the other. So they're not equally wealthy even if they have the same wealth, because the one who is more risk-taking is likely to end up wealthier, and so on. And that completely boggles the mind, and people just ignore it. Decision theorists ignore it. So you have this idea that it's not only individuals who look at problems one at a time. Decision theorists look at problems one at a time. That's a big challenge to rationality. I'll give you an example just to bring that to life. Having no slides mean that I have very little control over what's going on in this lecture. But I'll just go on for a while longer and then I'll stop. But there is a famous problem that Paul Samuelson actually formulated. It's known as Samuelson's friend's problem. And Samuelson once asked a friend of his, would you take a gamble with a 50-50 chance to lose $100 or to win 200? And his friend basically formulated loss aversion. He said, no, I wouldn't, because the displeasure of losing 100 is more than the pleasure of gaining 200. And then Samuelson asked his friend, would you take 10 of those gambles? And he said, now you're talking. Now, and that's the way that people respond. They will take 10 of those, they will not take one. Now, there is a complicated argument within utility theory about what's rational or irrational. I have a different observation on this problem. It seems to me that it's an ill-posed problem. What does that mean, to have a preference that you are given now for this gamble? Why should you consider this gamble? The point is, you're not on your deathbed. So you will have other opportunities to gamble. So it's never the case that you have just that one decision. There will be future decisions. You have to have a policy. You should have a policy that takes into account the fact that you'll gamble in future. I haven't seen that in decision theory. It's just, people tell me it's just too complicated. So, you know, we just march on. We ignore it. So there are challenges. Now, what did prospect theory add? And I'll go quickly. We added these objections to rationality. We added the notion of gains and losses. We added loss aversion. We added the endowment effect, which is basically an expression of loss aversion, that if you know, it's the standard experiment is that you give people a mug. In half of this room, half of the people would get a mug and the other half would not, and everybody would get a questionnaire. And the questionnaire of the people who got a mug would say, this is your mug, you can go home with it. Alternatively, you can receive money instead. So if you turn it back, we'll give you money. And what will your choice be? And this is for real. If we offer you 50 cents, $1, $1.50, up to $10. Now, the people who don't have a mug, their questionnaire says, in effect, look at your neighbor's mug. And now, you could have a mug like this, or you could have a sum of money. And we would like your choice now. What will you do if you know, we offer you 50 cents, $1, $1.50, $10? Now, I want to point out, these people are in what are called strategically equivalent situations. They can go home with a mug, or they can go home with money. They don't set the same price to the mug. The people who have the mug value it at roughly twice the amount that the people who choose between the mug and the other do. That's called the endowment effect. And I'll talk about the endowment effect later, because the story about the endowment effect is getting complicated in an interesting way. This is a demonstration that my friend and the guru of behavioral economics, Dick Thaler, and I did together with another friend, Jack Netch. We found, and it's a big, and I already mentioned that actually, that the attitude of people to gambles in gains and in losses are not equivalent. And the standard manifestation of this is that you tell people there is that disease that you know, if is likely to kill 600 people, and there is a program, or there are two programs that are. One of these programs will save, how is it? It will save 200 lives. And alternatively, there'll be a 1/3 chance to save all 600. That's one frame. And the other frame says, in one case, 400 people will die. Alternatively, there is a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die and a 1/3 chance that no one will die. People don't have the same preferences. It's the same problem, but in the risk, in the positive, the gain frame of saving lives, people like the sure thing. In the losing, people like the gamble. You can feel that right away. What is your preference between a 90% chance to lose $1,000 and a loss of $900 for sure? A vast majority of people gamble on this one. You reflect the problem. That's what we call the reflection effect. You reflect the problem in the domain of gains. People are risk averse. So that was a contribution of prospect theory. Again, many of these things were known. The nonlinearity, we spoke of nonlinear decision weights. David Leibson mentioned that yesterday. We spoke of framing. We spoke of narrow framing. Well, it's part of the theory to speak of narrow framing. This is looking at problems one at a time rather than at the policy. Now, prospect theory has induced a lot of blindness. And, you know, it's... and let me tell you how bad it is, because it's really pretty bad. It's embarrassing. The theory, prospect theory, was defined on gambles with at most two non-zero outcomes, with stated probabilities and financial outcomes. That was it. That's the domain of the theory. We worked for years trying to account for everything we knew about people's behavior in that ridiculous domain. I mean, who cares about people's preferences, you know, between gambles that have at most two non-zero outcomes? It's a nothing thing. There's nothing there. But we did our homework, and that turned out to have been very wise. Now, the point is, in some ways, this is a ridiculous domain on which to base a theory of choice. Prospect theory, believe it or not, is called the theory of choice. It's not a theory of choice. It's a theory of choice between gambles, you know, with two non-zero outcomes. Prospect theory as defined, as it exists, and it's being altered now by other people, but as stated, could not account for the selling price of gambles. You have somebody owning a gamble. Prospect theory has nothing to say about gambles that people own. You cannot derive a buying price from prospect theory without some pretty heroic, I mean, without assumption. You cannot deal with an uncertain reference point. Well, that's the same thing as owning a gamble. And yet, prospect theory is now being taken very seriously. It's a theory of choice. People, you know, they encounter a problem and they ask, what would prospect theory say about it? Now, I would say there is and this is an observation about the sociology of it. There is a disconnect between form and substance here. What makes a theory important and what makes it viable are not the same thing. It turns out, Amos and I worked 4 years. We had an early version of prospect theory that we did in 6 months. Then we spent, I think, 3.5 extra years polishing it. I looked at the early version of the theory not long ago. It has about 90% overlap with the published version. It was dead in the water as a theory. The polishing was essential. We didn't waste a minute in those 3.5 years because we really made the theory very defensible. We polished, we anticipated. We had the specter of a graduate student, actually. We did not want graduate student writing theses, finding flaws in prospect theory. So we had that graduate student in our mind, and we are going to make their life as difficult as we can. And we did, really. I mean, that paid off, those 3.5 years of work. Now, so now you have a theory that's a pretty good theory of that domain, that ridiculous domain. Now, what makes it important are a few ideas. Loss aversion, nonlinear probability weights, framing, you know, those are the ideas. So that's what's important. Now, those we had in 1975. All the important ideas, virtually all, except one, were there in 1975. And the theory would not have been viable. So the sociology of it, which is kind of interesting, is you've got sort of competence tests that you've got to pass. And people will not take you seriously unless you pass those tests. Now, once the theory passes the test, then you can take its ideas and you can use them. But there is a really interesting disconnect. Nobody cites theories unless they have passed that test. You know, they're viable in their domain. They're serious. They're professional. And in some ways, like the comments I was making yesterday, this is odd. This is substance and form, and it's a lot of weight is on the form and on the nature of the sociology of how this is played. Okay, a lot has happened since. among other things within prospect theory, I think it turns out that prospect theory is not a good theory of risk-taking. I think that the real factor that causes risk-taking is something else. It's optimism. People take risks because they don't know the odds. They just think they know the odds. If they knew the odds, they'd be risk-averse. So a lot of the investment world and a lot of entrepreneurship in particular, people are completely unrealistic when they start restaurants and they start, barber shops and things like that. They think they'll succeed. Most of them will fail. That's why people take risks, in my view. It's nothing to do with, with prospect theory. What else happened? Well, the end of the cognitive revolution happened, and that's important. And now the new models of decision-making are heavily loaded with emotion. That's a big deal. So the endowment effect can be manipulated, Jennifer Lerner has shown, by putting people in one mood or another. It changes when people are angry or when they're disgusted. I mentioned yesterday the affect heuristic. People make decisions because they like things or they like doing that particular thing. There is a lot of work on regret. And there is a beautiful paper on risks as feelings. Basically, risk is fear. I mentioned that yesterday in attribute substitution. Risk is fear. And there is fear and there is hope. And people are seeing that a lot more than they did. And that's a big change because there is none of that in prospect theory. The only vaguely emotional thing in prospect theory is loss aversion. Now there are, and be happy, this is my last slide, so my last slide of notes. It will take me a few minutes, but not much longer. There are newer developments, very new. And that's a sort of resurgence of rationality. So there is a book that's going to come out by Peter Walker, a mathematician with whom Amos collaborated during Amos's last years very closely. And the book is called Prospect Theory, and it's a labor of love. And Peter Walker is just as good as they come. And he sent me the book, and I don't really recognize prospect theory there, because he has made the agents of prospect theory pretty rational. They don't have framing effects. You can't frame them. There are no preference reversals. It's prospect theory for highly sophisticated agents. And what it's intended to do is to solve the problem that David Leibson was mentioning yesterday. It's intended to allow theorists to do theory the way they're used to doing theory, but with a somewhat richer and more sophisticated idea of how people put values on things. Big development. There is another development that I mentioned yesterday, and it's an empirical one. The endowment effect that I mentioned on mugs, you can try it on mugs. You are very likely to replicate it on mugs. There is a brilliant economist at the University of Chicago, John List, who's been doing real-life experiments on people's choices. So he is himself, he worked his way through college by trading baseball cards, and those are the situations in which he experiments. And he has done dozens of experiments. And he and the author of Freakonomics, Steve Levitt, have written several papers together, but the empirical work is John's. What they find, I didn't like this, I still don't, but what they find is you take highly experienced traders, endowment effect is virtually gone on baseball cards. So naive traders, you get it beautifully. Experienced traders, much, much less. Now the devastating result is experienced traders don't show the endowment effect on mugs. So it's not only baseball cards. They have adopted the attitude of an economic agent. Everything is for sale. They value buying and selling. By the way, I had encountered that once with Herbert Simon, because I remember in the 1980s, famous Herbert Simon, came to Vancouver, and I asked him, would you sell your shirt off your back? And he says, why not if the price is right? And so there is something that happens to people with experience. They begin to think very differently. This is a result that economists love, and you can see why. Then there is a new field, and yesterday I mentioned Shane Frederick and his studies of the bat and ball and similar things. It's not the only problem he has several problems. All of them sort of problems that have an intuitive solution that is appealing and incorrect. Now, people who yield to that temptation are, let's put it this way, people who resist that temptation, a small minority of people who check themselves, are clearly highly intelligent. There are few of them. They do not show the reflection effect. Now, I comfort myself. There are, I think less than 10% of those people around, so most others are good prospect theory people. But this minority is interesting, and it's bound to tell us something. These are people who have a different representation of what the outcomes are, a representation that is beyond the surface characteristics of gains and losses. It goes deeper, probably, into what the thing really is, or what the thing really is worth. So that's very new work, and it's just beginning, and you can see rationality is coming back, and emotion is coming back, and we have learned something, but we went too far, and now the wheel is turning. Thank you.
I didn't have any slides to begin with, so there was no loss in my case. You're sadder than I am, I guess, though we're in the same state. Well, I take a little bit comfort in the fact that I think one explanation of why there aren't enough, children pointing out the emperor and so forth, and that you were a great man in being a child, right, is that you were an outsider, and as you said yesterday, you're deeply intuitive. And I think that that's one reason to keep around respect for intuitions. But I'm an outsider. I don't expect to have the same success that you had. I'm a philosopher, and but also I don't know much of the research that was discussed today. I know that Professor Kahneman was kind enough to send me an introduction to a book that he wrote. He gave me his Nobel lecture, or a background that he had to give the Nobel Committee. And it's on the basis of that I formulated some remarks in the first section. In the second section, I was told I have 20 minutes, and I hope I can make use of that. I'll repeat some things that I said in an article that I published in 1997 in the journal Ethics on the relation between the loss no gain theory and harming and not aiding that philosophers are just discussing. It's reprinted in a recent book of mine called Intricate Ethics. So section 1. Although Kahneman yesterday said that he tried to steer away from presenting a theory of the rational agent, in the material that he sent me, those two pieces, he does say some things about what being ideally rational involves in his view. First, there are formal criteria: coherence and consistency. For example, treating cases that one takes to be identical identically. Kahneman says that at first, in his theoretical or in his empirical research, he would use a theory to decide if cases were alike, an objective outside view. But eventually he used the standard of the agent himself. If the agent said there was no difference between the cases that justify different responses, then if the agent were rational, the agent would treat the different cases identically and be puzzled internally, feel tension if he didn't. So I call that sort of the agent identity standard. But Kahneman says that he also came to think that coherence and consistency were too lax to describe a rational agent. Even though ordinary agents can't meet that standard, it's also too lax, because one could have these properties of coherence and consistency in one's views and attitudes and still come to what he calls foolish conclusions. So he introduces what I think of as more substantive, non-formal notions of rationality. For example, he says that it is rational to maximize experienced and decision utility. It is rational to treat money as fungible, and other sorts of things. Now, I just want to compare some of these views with what some philosophers think. I'm not a philosopher who focuses on the theory of rationality, but I have some friends, right? I have people, as they say. Right? Some philosophers might want to limit the notion of rational to the purely formal criteria. But it's important to realize that failing to meet the formal criteria for rationality, for many of these philosophers, not all, while it makes one subject to rational criticism, does not result in one's being irrational. Irrationality tends to be construed more narrowly. For example, if an agent believes that a set of premises supports a conclusion, and yet he does not believe the conclusion, he seems to be at war with himself internally, and this is taken to be irrationality. I think this dovetails with what Kahneman is speaking of when he talks about responding differently to cases that one oneself identifies as identical. But it doesn't apply to making mistakes in probability calculations or some of the other cases that he works with. If someone makes a mistake in reasoning and so does not believe that a conclusion follows from a set of premises when it does, many philosophers will say he is not ideally rational, but not irrational, because he does not at one and the same time think the premises support the conclusion and yet not believe it. Okay. The most important notion of a rational being for many philosophers is that of someone who acts, decides, and believes for reasons, and evaluates whether desires, facts, etc., are reasons that justify beliefs, decisions, and acts. On some views, the rational being is one that recognizes the reasons that there are, really, independent of whether anyone thinks there are there, for believing and acting. But that a factor is a reason in this strong sense does not mean that one would be involved in an inconsistency or incoherence if one didn't recognize it. One might simply fail to see what is true. And that is a failure in being a rational being on this view, not recognizing a reason, but not a failure of inconsistency or incoherence necessarily. Now, when Kahneman says that it is rational to maximize experienced utility, I think most philosophers would state this as the view that maximizing experienced utility is an overriding reason for action or choice. And most would deny that this view is true. There are many other reasons that can justify choice that can conflict with and override maximizing experienced utility in the view of many. For example, it might be reasonable to minimize the maximal painful experience one ever has, reduce the peak in that peak and end rule that was discussed yesterday, even if this means that over a period of time, the sum of all the small, much less painful experiences gives rise to a greater total. This is giving weight to distribution, right? And minimax, right? Or one could reasonably decide to sacrifice utility for the sake of doing something worthwhile, for someone else perhaps. One could reasonably choose not to spend one's life plugged into what Robert Nozick called an experience machine, which is imagined to maximize one's experienced utility. One could refuse this because then one would not really be doing anything in one's life. And maybe that is a reason for not plugging oneself in. I think one can give other arguments against things like fungibility of money is always rational, but I'm not sure I'll have time for everything, so I'll skip that. Now, some philosophers think that there can be conflicts between avoiding irrationality and acting for the best overall reasons. So some might take as an example, Huck Finn in the Mark Twain story. He believes a slave is property, and property should be returned. He believes Jim is a slave, and he believes he should return Jim, but he doesn't. He could be accused of irrationality in the sense of internal incoherence between his beliefs and judgments about how he should act and acting. And yet he may be responding to the reasons there really are for not returning a slave, even though he's not conscious of them or consciously believes them. That could make him, on some philosophers' view, more of a rational being than if he were internally consistent. Furthermore, some philosophers believe that the fact that Huck knows that he could avoid inconsistency by giving back the slave provides him with no reason at all, to return the slave. Consistency is a merit of a rational being, but it's not a reason for action. Now, the possibility that an agent could be responding to reasons, though he can't see how, or that he is related to a concern I have with using what I refer to as the agent standard for identity, namely that a subject's own sense that two scenarios are the same, though he responds differently, is what should give us our notion of irrationality. In a series of cases that some philosophers discuss, known as trolley problems, who here doesn't know of the trolley problem? I'll frame it that way. Okay. Many people say that one may turn a trolley away from killing 5, though it will then kill someone else on a side track. Some of these very same people also say that it is impermissible to use a machine to push someone off a bridge so that he falls in front of the trolley and is thus killed, though this prevents the trolley from killing the 5. So in one case they'll kill someone to save 5, in one case they won't. Yet they may not be able to say that the cases differ in any way that would justify the differential judgments of permissibility. They think that in all relevant respects, for moral purposes, they're the same. They may be puzzled by their own differential responses to cases that seem to them relevantly identical. And yet, I think, perhaps, they may be responding to a factor that really gives a reason to treat the cases differently, though they cannot formulate it in words, what it is. I think it is worth taking their intuitive reactions seriously and seeing if one cannot find factors of which they are not consciously aware, so they would classify these cases as identical, that really differentiate the cases. These factors may account for their responses and also might be reasons that justify their responses. All right, section 2. Now, just let me consider some of the following claims that I garnered from the papers that were sent to me of Kahneman's concerning losses and no gains. One of the ways of getting people to treat cases that are truly identical differently is by framing. That is to say, given different descriptions with no differences relevant to decision making that lead people to represent and treat cases differently. Now, Kahneman mentioned the disease case in which we can frame the coming disease case. We can frame the same outcome as a loss of life, 400 will die, right? Or a not saving of life. Okay, we save the 200 instead of possibly more, right? Now, people will be more averse when the situation is framed as a loss, and they'll take risks to avoid the loss, than when it's framed as a no gain. They'll be more conservative. Though the outcome state is the same. Now, I'm just, describing Kahneman's views here. Now, this shows, prospect theory claims, that people take the bearers of utility to be changes, losses or gains, not states that they wind up in, right? Because they would wind up in the same situation. Kahneman also says that the loss-no-gain distinction shows up in the moral notion that it is worse to impose a loss on someone than to refuse to share a gain, though the person, who doesn't get the gain and who suffers the loss, right, winds up in the same exact state. Now, a set of cases he gives that I call the shovel cases are meant to illustrate this last point. In one case, there's a blizzard coming and a store owner raises the prices of snow shovels. In the second case, a store owner gets a reduction on shovels from the manufacturer and does not pass along the gain to the consumer for a lower price. In the two cases, the ultimate price is the same, yet people think that in the first case, there's unfairness, but in the second, there isn't. I think this was one of the trick questions we were asked at the very beginning yesterday. Now, Kahneman seems to believe that while people do in fact respond to changes differentially, this is not rational when there is no real difference in the outcome, and it would be rational just to focus on the outcome. This was, at least in some cases, this is what he imagined at the very end of his discussion today, if you had to construct a rational being, etc. So what about philosophical perspectives on this issue, coming, from across the yard, from a different building, a different field, whatever? Well, many philosophers have been concerned to show that it matters for moral purposes how an outcome comes about, and not just what the end state someone finds themselves in is. So some have argued that there is a moral difference between harming and not aiding someone, even though the person winds up in the same state. A particular instance of this is the claim that all other things equal, it matters morally whether one kills a person or whether he dies because one does not aid him. Imagine someone drowning, right? At one point in this debate amongst philosophers about this, some philosophers suggested that harming not aiding distinction maybe just was the loss no gain distinction. Even Bob Nozick suggested this in his book Rationality. And subject to the same framing effects, and so maybe not really of moral significance. So I set myself to examine this issue. I was curious. So the first thing some philosophers do when checking out the moral significance of a pair of distinctions, like harming, not aiding, let's say, is, some philosophers do this, is use cases involving each of these distinctions, but they're careful to hold everything else constant in these two cases, aside from the distinctions they're trying to see if have they any significance, to see if there are different intuitive responses that could be attributed to the distinctions themselves and not to any other factors in the case. So this is just a methodological point. You've really got to worry about equalizing. Now, I think that in some of Kahneman's cases that are meant to show an intuitive difference between loss and no gain, he does not seem to hold everything else constant. There isn't enough equalization. For example, in the shovel cases, I was surprised to see that there's a blizzard in the first case, but there wasn't in the second. Now, if we remove the blizzard in the first case to equalize the context, you know, the owner of the store raises prices, but there isn't any blizzard coming, I think the sense of unfairness goes away. It's also important to equalize for human agency. A loss and no gain could occur as a result of natural facts, not subject to human control. But if we are considering someone refraining from aid, then we should consider a loss brought about by human agency as well. These are just methodological points. Now, let's consider the disease case again. For some philosophers, though I'm not attributing this to Professor Kahneman, one of its implications seemed to be that we could frame a result, well, maybe this is an implication that he accepts. We could frame a result of not instituting a certain program as either a loss of life, deaths, or not saving people, viewed as a no gain. People are more averse to the loss than providing the gain. All right. But some philosophers thought that this might have the following implication. If we could successfully frame the situation of a person in one pond as someone who will lose his life if we do not act, maybe we change the baseline. He's not drowning at the moment, but certainly will if we don't, etc. And we frame the situation of a person in another pond as someone who will not be saved if we do not act, maybe because we think he's already at the point of death and so forth. But we can only go to one place, one pond, all right? It might be thought that we would be more averse to the first situation where the person will lose his life rather than the one in which his life won't be saved. But this is hardly true. I mean, this can't be true, all right? I think that there would be an equal pull. So I didn't think that anything that could be true about the disease case would have this implication. Next, notice that the flu case shows that not aiding, part of the contrast that the philosophers are concerned with, who are concerned with harming and not aiding, the flu, I call it flu case, the disease case, right, shows that not aiding can be framed to involve both a loss and a no gain. That was the point of it. But according to the view that harming is worse than not aiding, cases of not aiding someone, when this results in a loss to them, are still thought to be less bad than harming someone. So pushing someone into the pond is worse than failing to prevent his loss of life. That's the claim of the harming not aiding distinction. Now, this led me to believe that there is more to the difference between imposing a loss, like pushing someone in the water, and not providing a gain, than the loss no gain distinction. It is the fact that one would be causing the loss in one case, but not the other, that seemed to stand out. I don't know if that's the ultimate right answer, but it seemed that stood out. This further suggests that the harming not aiding distinction is not subject, or may not be subject, to the same framing problems that a loss no gain distinction might be, and supports the view, or at least shows that there's possible support for the view, that rationality does not require simply evaluating end states rather than how they come about. Indeed, I think that some of Kahneman's data better support the harming not aiding distinction than the loss no gain one. Consider the shovel case again. Suppose that the price of shovels goes up because the manufacturer raises prices and the store owner does not pass along to the shovel buyer a reduction she receives on another item from the manufacturer. In this case, the shovel buyer suffers a loss because the owner does not aid him. But the store owner did not impose the loss. She did not rescue him from it. Right? And she is not seen as unfair. So, my concluding remark is that even those who support, some philosophers, like I won't mention who, the correctness of taking how states come about into account rather than just end states, even they need not accept what I sometimes read as the strong version of prospect theory's claim that it is only changes rather than states that have utility. As Kahneman himself sees, sometimes people give up things or cause things to be given up in order to get something else that is much better. And this means that they must be attaching utility to things or states as well as to changes. Now, I hope, have I taken up time, or shall I go back to, do I have a minute to go back to fungibility? Fungibility? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about this, but I was thinking, Kahneman says it's rational to treat money as fungible, and philosophers would see this as the view that there is some overriding reason to treat money as fungible. But this may not be true. This is a substantive reason, not just a formal characteristic or of rationality. But this may not be true if there is reason to be concerned with things other than one's eventual total wealth. So suppose I can either pay a taxi $20 to get to a store where I will buy something for $20, or I can pay a taxi $39.99, which is what he asks for, to get to the same store where I can buy something I want just as much for 1 cent. Now, if I were being gouged by the taxi driver, he would get much more than his fare, that is to say, for such a ride. This could give me a reason to refuse to take one taxi ride rather than the other, and if the latter taxi drive was the only choice I had, it might, I think, reasonably give me a reason not to take the taxi and forego the item I want if I don't want it too much. Now, it's only if one thinks that, it is only if one thinks that considerations such as who gets my money, the distribution of money, whether they deserve it, whether I am being treated unfairly, that these could not be reasons that justify an act for a rational agent, that one would think that money should be fungible, I would think. That's the end of my comment. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I'm delighted with Frances' comments because they give me the opportunity to take up many new things that I will point out that I never mentioned the word irrational. It never came up. I am not interested in the word irrational. And furthermore, and that is very important, I specifically reject the idea that what Amos Tversky and I were doing was to question the rationality of people. We were questioning the rational agent model, and we were rejecting that model as being both too demanding, because it is impossible for a finite mind, and too permissive, because it allows foolish choices to be made. So all the comments about rationality, all our comments, we're not that people are not rational, but people are not following the rational agent model. So it's all in the context of a debate with that model that our work was couched. And I wrote in in describing this lecture that it's a silly question in my mind, whether, anyway, that is not a question that I'm passionately interested in, deciding whether people are or are not rational. There is a model that specifies rationality. I think it's a bad model. I mean, I think it's actually, it doesn't seem normatively compelling to me because it's not feasible. So, if it's a model for finite minds and finite minds cannot apply it or cannot live by it, then it leaves me cold. So we've never done anything on that. On several other comments by Francis, well, they indicate to me that maybe I should have given more than 3 lectures here, because there is some work actually that I have done, and I think, in fact, it may be that I began that line of work in psychology. I began a line of work on counterfactuals. And it turns out that, and in that work, one of the standard examples in that work is that people treat doing and not doing very differently. And so one of our standard examples, and it's about regret, but we have the same thing about blame. And one of our standard examples is we have 2 investors, and investor A and investor B. And investor A had an opportunity to buy, Google stock, and did not. And because he did not, he is $20,000 poorer than he would have been if he had bought Google stock. Investor B used to own Google stock and sells it. And he has sold it, and now he's $20,000 poorer than he would have been if he had not sold. And the question is, what is people's intuition? Who has greater regret and who is more likely to be blamed as a fool? And the answer is there is a major difference between doing and not doing. So that selling stock and not buying it are not equivalent, and this goes on to moral cases. So I plead innocent to the charge of having ignored the distinction between doing and not doing. It actually looms very large in my life. And it's many of the comments that you made, for example, about fungibility and so on, that what we were saying, economic theory says money is fungible. It is not. And people don't even think necessarily that it should be. So I wanted to make that a little clearer. I think I will allow myself a comment about philosophy and the psychology of philosophy. And it's related to the methodological distinction that I mentioned yesterday between subject experiments and within subject experiments. In the between subject experiment, each individual is in one situation, and it could be a different situation. And we infer inconsistency, or we infer such things from the fact that the groups of people presented with different frames, say, end up with different results. That's the between subject. The within subject experiment, somebody sees both frames, or both problems, or the 2 trolley problems, and has to struggle with reconciling them. There is a profound difference between the intuitions that arise in the within subject and in the between subject experiment. Most of us, most of the time, live in a between subjects world. We encounter problems one at a time. Philosophers live in a within subject world. They always have comparison cases. So for them, it's the comparison that they work with. Comparisons engage very different intuitions than are engaged when you encounter the same problems one at a time. This is a very deep issue of framing, and it's inevitable. This is built into the epistemological situation of dealing with moral problems. So we were, and we were interested in, and actually we studied that among people, and we drew a distinction between clear intuitions and strong intuitions. And a clear intuition can be a minute difference between two cases, but it's a decisive difference. I mean, would you like to go to Rome for a visit, or would you like to go to Rome and get an extra $1? It's not a big deal, but which of these two is better is not questionable. But there are cases, if you did that between subjects and measured the amount of money that people are willing to pay or whatever, of course you would get no difference between those two. But when you put them together, the answer is clear. In other cases, it isn't clear even when you put things together. But what is generally true is that our intuitions, both about choices and about preferences, and about moral preferences and moral intuitions, depend very critically on whether you are in the between-subject world or in the within-subject world. And we generally studied intuitions in the between-subject world. That is, and what we studied when we looked at fairness was what are the strong intuitions, not what are and we actually commented on that in an obscure paper. And I think that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, sure. Yeah?
So near the end of your formal talk, in describing the baseball card trader who was immune to the endowment effect, you said it was an evidence of learning. And what I'm wondering is there evidence that it's learning or selection?
No, it's evidence that it's learning because naive traders do show the endowment effect. It's
But for example, is there a lollipop test? Can you take young people and pick those who show less of an endowment effect and say this guy's going to be a better
trader? Quite possibly. You know, I mean, it really is. There is a counterfactual involved in. There's a kind of counterfactual thinking in seeing things as things that could be traded. You know, it's a different way of valuing things than the idea of owning it. And then it's not giving it up. I mean, obviously, in routine transactions, there is no endowment effect. That is, when you go to the store to buy a pair of shoes, the person who sells it to you is not losing shoes. You know, they're just getting money. I mean, it's a different kind of transaction. And so you can learn to value things as if they were part of that transaction. And it's definitely learning. Yes?
So, I'd like to go back to the game theory. In game theory, we have the vision. Now, it usually applies to biology. In the question of whether you could ever evolve cooperation versus non-cooperation. And there's a famous book by Axelrod, which was the tit for tat thing, is that you run this thing over and over and over again, no matter what and that was the best strategy. Now, to some extent, that does lie in your realm. There's aversions, there's differences. Now, the question then is, can you change this by changing the linearity of the logic? That means in game theory, you're saying that one of the axioms is that the logic is
the linearity of probability. I don't know, actually. You know, it's not my field, so I don't know that the prisoner's dilemma has been treated, you know, as a gamble in that way. That the uncertainty about what the other person will do has been, you know, treated formally in that way. There are studies that look at reputation effects and so on that might begin to bear on it, but I don't think. I mean, I wouldn't know how to respond to your question.
But let's go back and then ask the question for yourself. One of the axioms that you are very much against is this linearity.
Well, not against it. I say it doesn't describe the behavior of people.
There are theories where people put nonlinearities in probabilities and have gotten better results.
Well, there are cases, you know, there are situations actually in game theory there are situations where doing the mathematically correct thing ends up with a disastrous result. And there is that beautiful thing of putting a lot of people in a situation where it's a competition. You have to choose a number between 0 and 100. And the person who comes closest to guessing, who gives the number that is closest to 2/3 of the average number that people will give, will receive a large prize. This turns out to have a correct solution, game theoretic solution, which is 0, because that kind of thing unravels. So you start at a number, and it's 2/3 of that number, and then 2/3 of that number, and so on. It turns out, if you want to win that game, you should say something like 13, because that turns out to be 2/3 of the average of what people say. So people who know too much game theory, it isn't good for them in that particular situation. So, and I'm sure there are other cases. Yes.
I'm still curious, what theory or what idea made you get Nobel and have no time to read the whole book? What specific theory and idea made you get Nobel?
Okay. There's a perfectly good answer to that question. What gets you Nobel, and you get it not because of things you do. So it is not given to the best paper. It's not what happens. It is given to work that had influence on economists. So if I got the prize, it's because my friends, the behavior economists, were active and did work that other economists respected. So the citation describes the work that we did, but that's not the reason that we actually got that but I think of it as a joint prize with Amos Tversky, died before I got it. It's not the reason for the prize. The reason was that behavioral economics developed and got some respect in economics, and that's the way it happens. And prospect theory had a lot to do with it, but mainly it's not. Prospect theory was helpful to behavioral economists in making their work respectable, but the important work in behavioral economics is separate. It's not my work. Oh, yes.
I'm interested in the force field analogy of decision making, and I'm wondering what role goals could play in such an analogy.
What
room is there for goals in such an analogy?
Oh, I mean, the goals are what defines the force field. So, there is that apple out there. Yeah, this is a way of looking at the human condition, by externalizing it. So you look at the situation of the main determinant instead of looking at the determinants inside. And of course, you've got to populate the world with things that the person wants or is afraid of, and so on. That's what induces the field. It turns out that it makes you think in different ways, and in some ways, I think it makes you think better about behavior. But that's how goals are represented. They're sources of power, of attraction or repulsion.
One last question?
At the Boston Mercantile Exchange, Andrew Will did an experiment where traders were given palm sweat testers to see how they acted during times of uncertainty. And the more rational traders, the better traders always had the least sweat response when markets were fluctuating more wildly. So I think, could this be explained through a systems model where if they remain rational, even though markets are volatile, that's because system 2, I guess the more rational system, the neocortex overpowers the system 1, the more emotional system?
I think, in that case, it would look as if system 1 is, it's already suppressed. And this makes a lot of sense because I've spoken to a lot of traders, actually. And there is something that they say, that they tell you, hedge fund managers and so on. They know when they're going bad. And they go bad typically if they've lost and they're losing their confidence. And at least one of them has set up a support group among hedge fund managers in New York. And they support each other when they're kind of losing it. And their response, very interestingly, is to adopt rules. So when they lose they stop going on their intuition. They fly by instruments. They adopt rules of behavior and follow them. I think that's very interesting. You know, it's just one anecdote. I don't know how real it is, but it makes sense to me. Thank you.
There. Thank you, and come back tomorrow.